All right, so just to kind of speed up the rendering part, because just like before, when we hit the render button, it's going to take a while to do, like for everything to calculate. So I'm just going to create some very basic shapes. Okay, so you're going to use your final modeled and textured stuff, and I'm just going to use these kind of stand-in pieces of geometry. And sometimes when you're modeling something and you're texturing stuff and you're doing all this other stuff and you just want to see what the rendering is going to look like, sometimes it doesn't hurt just to put in some stand-in pieces of geometry just so you can get a feel for what the lights look like and a feel for what the overall quality is in a very, very quick method. Then you can turn those off, bring yours back into the scene, and then everything should be pretty close to where it would be at, okay? So just for now, I'm just going to use these 3 items as my main items. And also, just for now, I'm going to drop my Mila on there and just set this to be a plastic. There we go. Okay. So the rendering part of this is we're going to a magazine-esque format. So we want this to be kind of like portrait-y, so it's like taller than it is wider. The title screen that we did was wider than it was taller. It was like movie. So I'm going to go to my render settings, and then in my render settings I'm going to scroll down to where it says image size, and I'm going to pick 8x10. So in this list, way at the very bottom is 8x10. Okay, and you can see how many pixels this is going to render out, 2400 by 3000. When we did the last rendering, we were 960 pixels across, 540 pixels tall. So obviously this is going to take a lot longer, except we're only rendering 1 frame, so it shouldn't take incredibly too long. All right, so that's the good thing about this. Imagine too, like if we were doing a billboard, holy cow, that would take forever to do that. Some companies actually will render, because it takes so long, they'll render like chunks. They'll render like the top left corner, and then a little bit over, and then a little bit over, and then they stitch all these things together because that's the only way they can physically render out something that big. Okay, so I set that to 8x10, so this sets it to 2400 by 3000. It has a resolution here, but that doesn't matter. As long as we know that it's 8 inches by 300, that gives us 24. 8 inches times 10, or 10 inches times 300 DPI gives us 3000. Okay, so this could really be 72. It doesn't matter. As long as this is still 24 by 3000, that's still an 8x10 at 300 dots per inch. All right. What else? This one is defaulted to, if you look at the top here, this defaulted to RenderMan. So as you're rendering stuff, sometimes your default will get changed, okay? Especially if you're not using your preferences. I'm not using mine, I'm using the instructor before me's preferences. This is another renderer. Just to show you what that is. Hey, the college is open today. This is a renderer by Pixar. Pixar is the company that makes Toy Story and Monsters Inc. and a bunch of other stuff. They have their own render engine. So what they do is they model stuff in Maya or 3D Studio Max or whatever they're using. Then they bring it into RenderMan to do all the final look stuff. So they have their own glass materials. They have their own plastics and metals and skin and all this stuff, and they render it through there. This renderer is actually like a free download. You can download this and start to play with it. And if you go into 3D, it's actually like a really beneficial thing on your resume to say that you've played with other rendering engines. Okay, so you played with Mental Ray so far. That's the one we're dealing with. RenderMan is another one. V-Ray is another one. What's the other one called? Arnold is another one. There's like a whole bunch of rendering engines that are very specific to what they're trying to do. So that's why this one is set up here as RenderMan, because the person before was using RenderMan. Whew. So I'm going to switch that back to Mental Ray. Everything else for now should be fine. I just needed to make sure this was set to 2400 by 3000. Now, just so we can see it, I'm going to hit the render button. And at this size, I don't have any lights in my scene. I don't have any real textures in my scene. It's just gray with a flat Mila on it. Okay? And you can see how long this process is taking already. It's like incredibly slow. Is it done? It's thinking. It's still thinking. It's done. There we go. All right. So I'm going to shrink this down just because it doesn't fit on my screen at that size. There we go. So this took 25 seconds at 2400 by 3000. And I'm pretty far zoomed out. So just for the ability to see this, I'm going to click on this blue circle. This is showing me what's going to render. It's kind of cut off on the top. So I go to View, I go to Camera Settings, and I say fill this vertically, and there we go. So now if I zoom in, I can see exactly what's going to render. Okay? So now I'll hit the render button again, and I'll see how long this render is going to take now that I'm basically filling my entire frame with these 3 items. And what should happen, obviously, is that the more of those items we're showing, the longer it's going to take to render. And again, our settings are still turned down. All we have is just a big render size. We haven't turned our quality settings up at all. So it's still chugging, it's still chugging. You can't see it, but it's on the other screen that it's still chugging along. And had I had textures on here, that process goes a lot slower.
Okay.
All right, there we go. Good. Okay, so now this is done. There we go. So this took 43 seconds. So now that I'm enlarged, this took almost double the time for that. And again, I don't have textures on this. If I had textures on this, this would probably take 2 times as long, maybe 3 times as long to render this out. So as we add more stuff to the scene, it's going to take longer and longer and longer to render this stuff out. Now if we look down here at the zoom, you can see the zoom is actually zoomed out to like 22%, okay? So if I hit this 1:1, I'm zoomed in all the way and I can't even see it. So it does me no good to look at this on screen at the full resolution because it's just too big, okay? So what I'm going to do is under options, I'm going to say test resolution, and here I can specify I want to render my final rendering at this high settings, but I want to do my test resolutions at a lower resolution, okay? So like we said, it's about 22%, so 25% is pretty close. So I'll do that. Now when I hit render, what should happen is this should happen a lot quicker because we're rendering it at 1/4 of the speed, 4 seconds for that rendering, and we don't really notice any huge difference, okay? Your goal anytime you render is iterations. We want to render out as much stuff as quickly as possible so we can get the easiest feedback so we can go through and tweak stuff all day long, okay? So now that we have that set up, I'm going to I'm going to turn this blue circle off for a second, not that, this. I'm going to create a little backdrop. So for something like this, like these products, I don't want to just drop them on a plane because what's going to happen is, and I'll render this out so we can see it, is that as a plane, it's going to look pretty boring inside the scene. Let me zoom out a touch. I'm a little bit too close to that. Probably turn that back on. There we go. What's going to happen too is that at these edges, we're going to have a cutoff where it just like stops. And that looks very abrupt, and you typically wouldn't see something like that on a magazine ad. It just stops like that. So what I want to do is I want to create what's called a cove. And if you've ever taken a photo class, you might be familiar with how they do these backdrops that are kind of like rounded instead of being perfectly square. So I'm going to go to my channel box. I'm going to take my divisions down to like 3. That should be good. And I'm just going to take this edge here, the back edge, and I'm just going to pull it up. There we go. And I'll take this edge here and I'll just pull this back. And then I'm going to bevel this. So I go to my modeling and I go to bevel. And what this gives me, nope, that's too big. There we go. Is this nice round cove here that instead of having that abrupt edge at the end of this, it'll have a nice soft transition going up that thing. Okay? So I can turn that back on, I can replace the objects. I can see that, hey, you like totally effed that up. Just move that over, just move this one forward. I could also rotate my cove if I need to. There we go. So now what we should have is nice soft transition. And again, we're looking at this very, very quickly. That only took 5 seconds to add that little cove in there. This is a much better transition here than we had before, than we had with that really dark stopping spot. Okay, so that's cool. So now I'm going to add some lights into the scene. And anytime you do lighting, if you're not sure about it, look at how they light stuff for photography. And because we're doing product, I'm going to look up just light photography product, and we'll see that they have this kind of setup that they use. Now if you look at this one, look what they have. They have a lens and some caps, and then look what's back there. You see that cove, just what we created, okay? Now ours is a little bit more abrupt. We have basically like a 90-degree angle we rounded. Theirs actually has this like sloping thing. So if we had too harsh of a corner right here, we could smooth it out and have more of a slope like they do. But the other thing they have are these big lights. So see these huge lights that are here? That's what's making their stuff look so good. Even this, look at this one here. It's kind of a neat thing that they're doing. They have a light over here hitting this sideboard and bouncing some light onto the character to give it more of a rim light. Okay. Now in Maya by default it won't do that. We have to turn different features on in order for it to calculate bouncing of light. But the premise is here we're going to have a couple lights in the scene. This is a good example too because you can see with this ball here they have two lights in the front, they have a rim light in the back, and then they have these two lights back here kind of flooding the background, getting rid of all those hard shadows. So don't be surprised if on your scene you have more than one light, okay? You can't get away with just one light, it just doesn't work. Even something like this is kind of a neat trick they do too, where they have this box and they're basically just like flooding the entire area with white light. And what it does, it creates a nice soft look to your object. And they still have that cove inside there, and then the camera's right in front. Okay, so we're going to try to mimic that inside of here. I'm going to create an area light. So I go to lights, and I use this area light here. And I just make it bigger. I just go to the move tool, and I'm just rotating it. And remember, if I want this to point at something, I can hit T, and then I get this other manipulator that I can just say, hey, you're going to point to this. Right there. And you're going to point, or be back here. And I'm going to go to the attribute editor before I do any duplicating, and I'm going to set this up. Every area light I use is going to use the same stuff. I need a decay on there. I can't have my light blasting full blown. So I change it to quadratic every single time. So every time you use an area light, every time it's quadratic. Because I use quadratic, the intensity has to go up. So let's say 100. Under the mental ray tab down here, I'm going to say use the light shape, and I'm going to turn my samples to 1. Alright, so now I'm going to look at my objects. Okay, and you can see how I'm kind of positioning these. This one obviously should be hitting the ground there. That one should be hitting the ground there. There we go. Sometimes it's very forgetful thing we do is we leave these objects floating. We go through this 2-hour render and then we realize, whoops, the object's floating. So don't be afraid to let them like hit the ground and actually intersect a bit. Alright, so that's cool. Depending on the angle that I go with, like a shot like this gives my products a little bit more power because I'm kind of shooting it up, where something like this kind of, you know, diminishes their power. So if I was trying to do something that maybe is a very feminine looking product, I may do something like this, softer or more feminine. If it's like Axe shaving cream or whatever, then maybe I would shoot it from below, like that. Alright, so I'm just going to set it standard for now. And it's important that as we work on this stuff, we kind of look at it from the same angle we're going to be rendering, because if we don't, then we're kind of setting up our lights for an area we're never going to see. So there's my rendering so far at 100 intensity. So I'm going to grab my light. I can go in the attribute editor and go to focus and say area light. There it is. And then I go to my intensity and maybe just put this to 1000. Don't be gentle with the settings, just crank them up. If it goes too far, then you pull it back down. All right. So that's looking pretty good. And again, we're not going crazy on the render time. This is about 8 seconds long. All right, I'm just going to keep this up over here. Go back to focus, get my area light. All right, so 1000 seems like it's an okay number. I really want this to be a bit brighter, especially on the projector. You can't really see it. So I'm going to go with 1500. Okay, I'm not trying to go like 1100 or 1001. I'm just like punching it. 500 each time. There we go. So that seems to be a better lighting situation. Now my original Mila that I have on here is just gray. So I'm going to crank it up to white just so we can see that better. And if this color is white, I should get something that's pretty close to white. But if you look at my glossy blend, this glossy blend is reflection, okay? So right now we're mixing the white color plus all the reflection that's in there, and that's why it's kind of turning out this gray color, because the reflection is reflecting all this black that's kind of out into the area here, all right? So one thing I can do is I can create a sphere, and I'll make the sphere huge, like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign a new, a favorite material, a surface shader to it. Okay, and the surface shader is basically just like a solid color. So when we did our UV layout, we did a surface shader, we dropped a checkerboard on it. I'm going to use a surface shader and put white on it. And what that should do is give me some white reflections bouncing into these surfaces. So now when I render this, what we should see is we should have some white reflections happening on here, a little bit stronger than we had a second ago. So there they were before, there they are after. You can definitely see there's a big difference in what we're seeing, especially off to the side here. Look how soft that is compared to that, okay? All right, so that's looking pretty good. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my light, here he is, and I'm going to duplicate the light, hit T, and then just scoot it over, okay? So in photography, they typically have like a 3-point lighting system set up. Your first light is called the key light. It's the light that is like your main light where it's supposed to be coming from. The second light, which is this one, that's going to be your fill light. All right, so this is the one that's going to kind of fill in all those dark areas. Your key light is usually the strongest. Your fill light is going to be darker. So I'm going to grab my fill light and I'm going to set this down to maybe like 800. There we go. All right. Now one thing you're going to notice is that I keep zooming out, adjusting my lights, and then keep zooming in. Okay? I could set up another camera that I do all my work in, but it's just easier to do everything right in perspective. But what sucks is that I keep having to zoom out, zoom in, zoom out, zoom in. So what I can do is I'm going to go under here. I'm going to set up my camera how I want it. Okay? Let me get this kind of positioned. Scoot that back a bit. There we go. Now, I want this one to maybe be like the center point. And then these two objects are kind of off to the side. Something like that. I'm looking at the spacing between these. I wouldn't want this one to be really close or hidden behind it or really far away. I'm looking at this trying to get it pretty symmetrical. There we go. All right, so maybe a little bit down like that. All right, that should be good there. So I'm going to go to View, Bookmarks, and I'm going to edit a bookmark. And this is basically, I'm going to say, make a new bookmark. And I'm going to call this render shot. Okay, and I'm going to add this to my shelf. There we go. And then I hit close. All right, so now what happens is if I move this, I click that button, it takes me right back. Okay, so every time I render, that's the shot I'm going with. Okay, and if I need to change it, I can just go back and make a new bookmark, add that to the shelf, right click and delete this one if I need to. Okay, so it's a really quick way to like jump back to that exact shot. So now we'll render and we should have the fill light and the key light shining on this thing. All right, there we go. So now we have both happening inside here. And you'll see my render time is about 11 seconds. There it was before, here it is after. So we definitely have an improvement on it. I think I want to pull that fill light maybe around a little bit. I think it's a little bit too close to that edge. I'm going to pull it this way and that way. There we go. I click my button to get back. I render it again. So you can see how many times I'm rendering this. Because I don't know what it's going to look like, I don't want to do too many things and then hit render because that's going to be hard to diagnose what's happening. All right, so there we go. So that looks a little bit better like that. Cool. I'm going to save this rendering here and I'm going to close. I'll just actually move this over. Okay. So now what I want to do is see these dark lines right here? I want to fill that in. I want to add bounced light into my scene to help fill in these areas that are just black. They shouldn't be black. So in my render settings under the quality tab, there's a advanced light samples. Oops. Right underneath the advanced light samples, it says Indirect Diffuse. And I'm going to turn on Final Gather. And what this does is it takes our light rays. Okay, so imagine our light's out here and it's shooting a bunch of rays. When the lights hit the surface, they're basically just stopping. Okay, so I want them to hit the surface and then bounce off and then hit other stuff. So actually lighting up other areas. So I save my render, I hit the render button again, and what we should have is now those black areas are going to be softer. Now it's going to do two passes. The first pass is this. See how ugly that looks, how choppy it looks? That's the final gather doing its stuff. Then it goes back and kind of cleans it up and then softens it. So look how nice that rendering looks. Okay? See how we have none of that blackness in here because now our lights are actually hitting a surface, taking some of that color information and bouncing it off into there. Now we've washed our surface out though. So you see how like white it is now. If I even put a label on that, I couldn't read it. So I'm going to grab my lights and just tone them down. So I'll take this back to like, let's say 900, and I'll take this back to 400. Click my button, save my rendering, render it again. Okay? Also, that big surface shader sphere that we created, that's actually now it's casting light into the scene. So geometry will actually start to cast light into the scene if we have final gathers turned on. So that's looking better. Okay? Now it's probably a little bit more difficult for you to see it, but on here there is like an actual like shading happening on my screen. On the projector you're not really seeing it too much. So that looks like it's pretty good. I probably could go and maybe knock these down to 200 and area light 1, knock that down to maybe 600. And I can also go to my surface shader, and instead of this being super white, I can just pull that down. Okay? If this goes to black, it's going to basically not emit light. If it goes to white, it's going to emit a white light. If I go somewhere in the middle, it'll emit less light. Okay? And that's that big sphere that's on the outside. So I save it again, I render again, and then we preview it. And our goal is to just try to get the best results as quickly as possible. But to do that, we have to make our rendering happen a lot quicker. When we added Final Gather, this really started to slow our station down. All right, that looks a lot better. So we're at 23 seconds. Here it was before, there it is after. Okay. And I think I even like it a little bit punchier right here. So I'm going to actually maybe take this up to 500. Go to my other light, maybe make this 800 again. Okay, so I'm going to assume that that's going to be good for now. Cool. I'm not liking the camera squish. If you look at the perspective of these cans, they're like pointing inward. Okay, and I'm not really happy about how it's pointing inward like that. Also, I have some dead space up here. I want to maybe play with that a little bit more. So I'm going to close my stuff. I'm going to select my camera. I'm going to change my focal length. So if I set this to 20, what that does is it gives me more depth inside my camera. So now as I get closer to my objects, you can see how we're really getting some perspective on this. Okay. Now I'm still getting this distortion here. So if I rotate it now, you can see how I can get rid of that distortion while still maintaining some of that perspective. I think I went too far with 20. I'm going to go with maybe 25. Just for fun, let's go to 80. Again, I like to see what things are looking like at different things. I don't like 80. There we go. 25 is good. Okay, so I'll hit my button again, but now my button is kind of like the old setup. Once I adjust my camera, now everything's kind of changing. So I'm just going to delete this. I'm going to reposition these. I'm going to grab my bookmarks and edit it. Add a new bookmark. Add that to my shelf. It did. Nope. Thank you. Probably because I clicked that button again. Alright, so it should be good there. Alright, so let's go back to bookmarks, edit, oops, new bookmark. And I'm just going to delete all these other ones I don't need. Delete that. Delete that. Delete that. Okay. Now I'll add this one to my shelf, and we should be good. Okay. So now we'll go back, save this, render the image again, and we're always just iteration after iteration after iteration. We're always tweaking our stuff and trying to get, again, the best rendering out of this. Now, you have to play the game, too, of what do I want my shadows to look like? What do I want my highlights to look like? What do I want my reflections to look like? All of these things we play with throughout the entire game. So right now, we don't really see, we see a bit of a specular reflection right here and right there. It's subtle. So maybe this is like stainless steel, where it has a bit more of a sharp reflection. Maybe it's brushed metal, where it's more spread out. Maybe it's plastic, which is more spread out. Maybe it's, I don't know, something dull and it has no reflection. So then we would always come back to our items, back to our Mila, and we would start playing with those settings. I want a sharper reflection. I take my glossy blend up a bit. I take my glossy roughness down a bit. Okay? This should give me a pretty sharp reflection. And again, because we're using Final Gather, it's going to take 25, 26 seconds. Because I added more reflections onto this, it should be a bit shinier. Okay, so now we can see these reflections right here. This is a reflection of this can. These white sparkles are reflections. Those sparkles are reflections. Okay, our ground doesn't have any Mila on it, so I'm going to add a Mila to the ground also. And I'm going to name this ground Mila. And I don't want any, I'm just going to show you what it would look like with reflections and stuff. Reflective plastic. All right, I'm just going to crank this color to black, take the glossy blend up, glossy roughness down, and set this to, that's fine. All right, so here's where we can start to introduce different colors into this too. If my backdrop is black, you're going to see that I'm going to actually be introducing some darkness into the mix of this. Very spooky. Also, we have the reflection happening here. This is reflecting perfectly into the ground. I may not want that, right? Depending on what you're trying to go for with your own ad, you may want to have the ground be more neutral. If you look at any of the product shots, stuff like this, a lot of time gets spent on creating that exact look. It's not just like a lucky thing that they shot it like that. Something like this, you can definitely see really sharp reflection happening in the bottom. Now that image was probably not actually a reflection in the bottom. What it probably was is photoshopped, cut out, dropped the image underneath, and now it looks like a reflection. Okay? Same thing here. This one is most likely it's a digital thing, and here is a reflection underneath there. Okay, so depending on the kind of item you're going for, you may have different kinds of reflections. This one is a softer reflection, and they use the color. So they have this really vibrant red. That vibrant red on white may not look good. So they use this kind of pinky, rosy color, and they have this soft reflection in the bottom to help draw this and make it look like a nice piece. Bless you. Here's another one with some reflection. Here's another one with some reflection. Here's another one. Okay, so you want to kind of play with it and find, what's going to look best. I don't like this at all. I think it looks ugly. So I'm going to take that and just make that white. Take my glossy blend down. Take my roughness up. The rougher this is, the more spread out and soft that reflection is going to be. Okay, so if this is cranked up all the way, here, I'll just leave it just like this, just so we can see it, and I'll render just that area. So right now we had crystal clear reflections. What we should have now is our reflections just get spread out. They just get diffused and softened. Okay, and you can see that's what happened there. Okay, typically you don't go to the extremes of that kind of stuff. You always want to find that middle ground. All right, so I'm going to take this glossy roughness down. I'm going to take my glossy blend down. take my color up. Maybe I'll introduce a different color into the mix. Something like that. A little too yellow. There we go. And now what this is going to do is not only is it going to color the background, but it's also going to introduce some color into my object. Because I have light bouncing, my object should get a little cast of it, even if it's, you know, subtle or very slight. All right, so that looks pretty cool. I mean, if you look at our backdrop, we don't have anything there that looks like a hard line. It looks like a nice soft transition happening right in the back. We have some okay shadows happening here. We're going to do some stuff to enhance it. Everything else on it is looking pretty decent. Okay, so remember I used white. You would actually use your bottles with textures on there and everything else to make sure everything's looking good. Go through, tweak all your settings. Look at individual pieces. What does the cap look like? What does the label look like? What does the bottom of the can look like? And do that for every single item in your scene. Okay, you want to make this look as realistic as possible. If you need to, that's why we have Google. You can actually Google stuff and find out what things are supposed to look like. Ideas. Cool. So let's pretend that this is all set. I like my lighting, I like my shadows, I like everything else in the scene. I'm ready to render it out. So I'm going to go to, I really need to add some bevels to this. This is just going to bother me if I don't. There we go. If you don't have bevels on your stuff like this, it just turns out really blocky looking. Like you can see how sharp that edge is and how ugly it is. It just looks really horrible. I'll add like 5 there. That's good. And that's good there. That's good there. Another bevel. All right, click our button again to get back here. Cool. All right. So just so you can see what that's going to look like, let me hit 3 on everything just so it's extra smooth. But what we should have now is this is just looking a lot nicer. Just without any extra settings on this, that's just going to look a lot more rounded. You know, you can definitely tell the difference in the two here. Okay, it looks a little bit more realistic just adding that bevel on top of it. There we go. Better. All right. So now let's say we're ready to actually render this thing out and get our final rendering. Okay. So I'm going to go to my render settings. I'm going to go to my common tab. This is still set to 24 by 3000. When we set up the other one to render it at a smaller res, it doesn't affect this at all. I'm going to go to my quality. I'm going to crank this up to 2. I'm going to go to my scene, and I'm going to open up the passes. And we talked about these passes on the title one. We didn't use any of them on the title one, okay? But we want to use ambient occlusion. So you see inside here how this edge doesn't really look like it's touching the ground. I mean, it might be, but we don't really know. That ambient occlusion will lock that in. It'll create this really nice hard edge shadow that's going to go around it, and it'll look like really, really awesome. The max distance, I kind of look at my grid, and I just see how far apart the objects are. Right now, like they're about 1 grid unit away. So me going in here and setting my ambient AO max distance to maybe 2, that should give me a pretty decent result. Okay. If you have a huge scene, you may want to set it to 5 or 10 or 20. But you'll see once you start playing with it. So I'm going to do this. I'm also going to do Mila Pass, that there. And I'm going to say not create yet. Right now I don't have a different Mila on each one of my materials, so I need to make sure I have a different Mila on each one. There we go, that's a different one. And then this one is a different one. Cool, okay. So I'm going to go back to here, I'm going to say create a matte pass. And what this does is it creates a separate rendering. So let's say that we render something out, and for whatever reason one bottle looks like green, and we want it to look like a muted version of our green, but the other one looks like crazy green. This matte pass will allow us to isolate just the one bottle and soften the colors on just that one bottle. Okay, so I want that. I want my depth pass also, and I believe that's going to be it. Yeah. So I'm going to say matte pass, create, use depth, ambient occlusion with this set to 2. And that should be good here, should be good there. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to save my scene. Actually, let me set my project. I didn't do that. There we go. I'll save my scene as product rendering demo. And then I'm going to go to, I'm going to wait. There we go. I'm going to go to rendering, and then I'm going to say batch render. I'm going to say to batch render. Okay. Now this is going to go through and it's going to render out just one frame. That's all we set it to do, just one frame. And it's going to use, because I didn't set up anything else, it's going to use this as the name that it renders out. So here's my Maya batch. It's at 12% for the CPU. That's common for this CPU usage to be pretty low while this is still setting up. So it says rendering with mental ray. So we just wait for it to get actually like 1% done or 2% done. There it goes. And then it should jump up to like 95, 96%. All right. If it doesn't, remember we can go back to, just crawls now. Let me just reset this to lower my priority. There we go, good. Good. All right, under render, I'm gonna go to the option box for batch render, and we can turn this off and set that to 12, and sometimes that will force it to use all the processors. Because of how long this rendering is going to take, it may take 2 hours to render this out. We want to use all of our processors available. The more processors we're using, the faster it's going to render. Okay? So we're just letting it go now. We're just going to let this thing sit and churn, and then once it's done, then I can finish it up. All right? And I'll have a separate lecture of how to finish this thing up because I want you to see what the process is for using the ambient occlusion, using the depth, using those matte passes. All right? So it's literally just a wait game now. So we set our priority to below normal, like that. We put the sign in front of our computer. We can close Maya down to save some resources, and that's it. There's nothing we can check until it's done. Okay? With the other one, we had frames we could check. We can't do that. We're basically trusting the stuff we already set up to be good. And if you want to check where it's at after it started rendering, you can just go to your folder. There, product Monday, Wednesday, images, and then inside of here, there it is. So I know with this set to 1 kilobyte, it's not done. That's all I know. That's all we can check until it's actually done rendering out. Okay? There's no thing saying how long it's going to take. There's no guesstimate we can do. It's just, it's going to take a crazy amount of time. We just have to be aware of it. Okay? So that's it. All right, so once you get done with your modeling, once you get done with your texturing, you've created some nice labels for your items, then you move on to this part. You create your backdrop, create your lights, and tweak, tweak, tweak until you have a nice little picture, and then we crank the settings up and render it out, and then we come back in a week and then check it out. Okay?